You are the CEO of ALTA Motors. Suddenly, an acquisition offer from Harley Davidson slides across your desk. Take it, and you get the funding to survive. You get access to suppliers, a chance to grow, a path to profitability. You get relief for investors that haven't seen a dime in close to a decade. Say no, and all you get is even more uncertainty. This was the choice ALTA CEO had in front of him. And he signed it. Little did he know, the signature represented the first bite of a poison pill. From that point, time started ticking.
What followed is a story buried in NDAs and corporate secrecy. But now, after 7 years, we get to find out what really happened. From someone who didn't have to read about it, but live through it. This is the story of ALTA Motors, of how the big bar and shield bully managed to brutally shut them down.
My name is Marc Fenigstein. I was the founding CEO of ALTA Motors.
If you were to define an inception point for the Harley relationship, where it all started, you'd have to go back in the early 2017. The California-based motorcycle manufacturer released a concept, the Redshift ST. In a way, this was more than just a rendering, it was a glimpse into their future plans. Urban, lightweight electric motorcycles that were still highway capable. It was modern, sleek, and cool. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away, back in Milwaukee, Harley Davidson was in trouble. They had to release the Livewire 1, their vision of the future, but the bike wasn't exactly the bright future most had in mind. It turned out to be heavy, limited in range, and limitless in price. Ultimately, they did end up releasing it, and it sold about as well as you'd expect. The point is, I think they realized their electric technology was not up to par. And the idea of a lightweight, cheaper model was appealing. They needed a second generation of the Livewire, but one that people actually wanted to buy. And that's exactly when their relationship with ALTA started. Harley Davidson had actually purchased 2 ALTA Supermotos and ran them through their durability programs at the Harley Davidson Proving Ground. They mentioned that the ALTA bikes passed and outperformed every electric motorcycle they had ever tested.
They approached us and said, hey, that bike, we want to build a Harley Davidson version of the Redshift ST.
But look, the ST was a concept at best. ALTA never thought their first platform was good enough for the street.
Not for them and not for Harley. This was a vision exercise, not a production one.
This bike is not going to be a street bike that we want to put the ALTA name on, you would want to put the Harley name on, but we're working on our second generation.
And that one? That was going to be more than good enough. For anyone. Harley Davidson enters a technical partnership with ALTA Motors, where essentially the two companies would work together in developing this new generation of electric vehicles. For ALTA, this made a ton of sense. They would gain access to Harley's supply chain, leverage their purchasing power, essentially lowering their costs and bringing them closer to profitability. The deal was roughly valued at $24 million in non-dilutive cash for ALTA, of which they only ever saw an initial $5 million. Remember, the startup had raised around 40 to 50 million throughout their lifetime. That 5 million was of great help, especially since it bought Harley no equity in the company. But then, the legacy manufacturer had another ask.
They also requested to invest in our previous round of funding, which was our Series B.
They wanted to invest a small amount of $1 million in their previous funding round. Looking at it now, this looks odd, as it's such a small amount of money for very little equity. Remember this, as it will become the catalyst for the events that were going to unfold.
Before going any further, you have to understand what the second generation was and why it was so important. It plays a key role in the story.
Sort of the equivalent of say, the KTM 690, the 701. But if you could actually get 450 weight and performance out of that same platform, that's what we thought we could do with electric.
This platform would simplify things, make everything better, faster, lighter, increase their range. This was the future of ALTA, their hope of really barging into the mainstream. It would serve as the technical base for their upcoming motocross, enduro, supermoto, and street bikes. That's why this was so important. Looking back, ALTA's entire future was relying on this. With all that being said, you have to ask, what was in it for Harley? Well, the partnership implied that the two companies would split development costs of ALTA's new platform right down the middle. After completion, ALTA would manufacture a Harley version of it and then sell it to Harley at a baseline price.
Since ALTA was a lean startup, their development costs were much lower than they would have been in-house for Harley. So, for the legacy manufacturer, they would get a new electric bike with better performance at a price much lower than they could have achieved themselves. In reality, ALTA would basically become a tier 1 supplier for Harley,
effectively multiplying their manufacturing volume and purchasing power.
It was a win-win situation.
ALTA ended up designing and developing most of the bike, from batteries to drivetrain and chassis. Meanwhile, Harley focused on suspension tuning, bodywork, and lighting for their variant. With this, there are two details we need to comprehend. For one, Harley was granted exclusive co-development rights. In plain English, only Harley could co-develop this platform with ALTA at that time. The second, and more crucial, detail relates to IP. So, who owned what?
We in fact had a register of IP that belonged to ALTA, a register of any intellectual property that belonged to Harley. And the terms of the agreement was anything that was developed by us on our own technology continued to belong wholly to ALTA, and Harley didn't have access to it.
What this means is that ultimately, Harley never owned any of the relevant second generation IP. Not the batteries, not the drivetrains, not even the chassis. Just bodywork, suspension, badges, things like that. Things that ultimately don't matter that much.
At this point in time, their relationship was still in the honeymoon period. Their technical teams got along well with one another.
In fact, Marc said that they were great to work with.
By spring, the two companies were full steam ahead on the new generation.
ALTA was also expanding as they introduced a technical upgrade to their dirt bikes, the R model. This was still based on their old platform, but it was more motorcycle for less money. Reviews started flowing in, praising them. They signed tens of dealers, introduced price drops, had multiple demo fleets with sales representatives touring the country in sprinter vans. From the outside, it looked like ALTA took Harley's money and went on a spending spree. But on the inside, the story was different.
Honestly, we didn't have the cash to expand rapidly. We desperately wanted to get to Europe, which we knew was going to be a great market for our bikes.
Sure, ALTA did expand, but that came mostly naturally. The dealer increase? That was interest generated by the glowing reviews for their updated bikes. The price drops? That was mostly old Model A inventory that the company had to get rid of. Ultimately, ALTA wasn't just recklessly burning through piles of cash. And that's simply because they could never afford it. They didn't see that much money from Harley by that point, so their burn rate stayed fairly flat.
There wasn't a rapid expansion. We didn't have like ballooning costs. There weren't sort of new costs where we got out ahead of ourselves.
Even so, March came around, and the startup needed to raise more money in their Series C, their third major investment round. This was expected, all part of the plan. ALTA was growing rapidly, so raising that cash should have been doable. They saw the light at the end of the tunnel. This series was supposed to bring in enough money to allow them to launch the second gen, with or without Harley, and finally become profitable. They were so close to it, but until then, they needed more money. And that's when the Bar and Shield realized something.
You see, if ALTA were to raise this investment round, that would put them in a comfortable financial position for quite a while. Possibly even forever, as they were expected to hit profits after this round. The fact is, ALTA still wanted the Harley technical partnership. It was still great for both. But crucially, they didn't need it.
Which was going to make the Silicon Valley startup a much tougher negotiator. Negotiate what, you might ask? Let me remind you, the Milwaukee company basically didn't own the rights for the second gen.
That would put us in a pretty strong negotiating position for the commercial agreement. How much are we selling these bikes to Harley for? And that was part of the deal that we hadn't negotiated yet.
If you ask me, and this is a personal opinion, Harley made a huge mistake here. By not setting a price, they left themselves open to possibly being taken advantage of. Harley realized their mistake, but there was one thing they could still do. You see, they could simply acquire ALTA.
That would stop any threat in its tracks while advancing their goals to enter the electric motorcycle space. So with it, they formulated a term sheet and sent it over. An offer. All of this was never public. The only official announcement was the earlier partnership. Everything was going down behind closed doors. Now, here is where you would expect the relationship to take a turn. But in fact, that wasn't the case. No, this offer was actually really good. It put ALTA on top of their Series C valuation. You have to understand, the dirt bike manufacturers' investors were pretty fatigued at this point. They had their money locked in for close to 8 years, and that's a long time in venture capital. If ALTA was to become a subsidy of Harley, everyone would have been happy. They would have had the money, the support, access to suppliers.
Knowing what happened, I can already hear you asking, how could they not see this was a trap?
Without hindsight, look at it through the founders' perspectives.
It all seemed like a great deal for everybody. It was going to cost Harley a whole lot less than developing this capability in-house. And, you know, for obvious reasons, it was good for us. So we went into the deal in good faith because it felt like they had every reason to adhere to their offer.
By that point, their collaboration had been smooth as butter. Their technical teams gelled together. So many reasons to say yes.
And we had this fantastic relationship with the design and the engineering team. We felt really respected. We felt like, oh, they get it. Like, they get the value here. They get how good we are at what we do.
Don't sign it and you gain uncertainty? You gain the privilege of struggling to raise more money? And remember, ALTA was a business.
Their first duty lied with their investors.
Their initial offer was a good offer. It was a good-looking acquisition.
I would argue that, back then, turning down a deal with so many positive incentives could have been considered irresponsible.
I don't think it was that naive of us to sign that term sheet.
After careful consideration, the ALTA board and leadership took a pen and signed that deal. Little did they know, that signature started a countdown timer. Poison pill. One that, at this point, couldn't be stopped. So with that, Harley owned ALTA, right? Not yet. Unfortunately, in the startup world, that's not exactly how things work. ALTA signed the term sheet, sending both companies into a 3-month due diligence period. During these months, work continued as usual. You see, whenever acquisitions like this happen, the acquirer has to make sure that the smaller company is what was advertised. Kind of like a home inspection after the offer, but before the money and deed changes hands. That due diligence is a period to look at their books and make sure that everything is as expected. Normally, unless outright fraud is detected, this is mainly a formality. But with it, the two companies also had to sign a no-shop agreement. It basically says that, while the books are checked, the acquired entity can't use the offer as a bargaining tool with the other companies. It does make sense, and objectively looking at the startup world, it's a perfectly normal process. And fair. As expected, by the end of June 2018, ALTA had ticked all the boxes. No fraud, the deal was good to go.
They reneged on their term sheet and they slid across a new term sheet that was essentially a shutdown and a salvaging of assets.
The new terms basically put a scrap metal valuation on ALTA. Their operations, product line and brand would get shut down, creditors would be paid, and Harley would harvest the IP and a handful of engineers. Suddenly, over those 3 months, ALTA turned from a company that was growing 200% year by year to just scrap metal? Obviously this wasn't right. And that's where my biggest question came in. How was Harley even able to do that? Was it even legal to back out, to bait and switch ALTA?
Essentially, the companies had signed 2 pieces of paper, the initial term sheet and the no-shop agreement. The problem is, a term sheet is not legally binding. Ultimately, it's just an offer, one with no legal repercussions.
A term sheet is not a contract. A term sheet is a letter of intent.
The catch? No-shop agreements are legally binding. In a nutshell, legally speaking, Harley had all the rights to not follow up on their terms, but ALTA had to stay silent throughout that period. For Harley's mergers and acquisitions team, this was a slam dunk.
The mergers and acquisitions teams and the legal teams were high-fiving themselves at Harley because this was brilliant.
Not only were they going to get ALTA, but they were going to get it for nothing. In corporate speak, this was perfectly executed. They left ALTA with no other option but to take their deal.
This begs another question. Why the sudden change of heart? Doesn't this legal process sound completely unfair? First of all, most transactions are done in good faith. Usually, these are simply formalities. Even if not, in case such switch happens, the startup could simply go and look for other investors, keep operating and find someone else. But in ALTA's case, there was a problem. Or opportunity if your name was Harley.
According to some leaks, allegedly, Milwaukee's initial offer might have never been made in good faith. Remember that $1 million investment? The one Harley asked to be part of? Remember how I questioned why that was relevant?
Well, $1 million might not have bought them much in equity, but it bought them something else. Access.
$1 million was the minimum threshold to get information rights as an investor. And what information rights meant is that they were getting monthly financial reports. They were getting our full books.
Essentially, Harley bought themselves a window into ALTA's cash flow. And that's when they saw the opportunity.
They used that info in ways that we probably should have anticipated, but we didn't because we were acting in good faith.
At ALTA's burn rate, Harley saw exactly for how long they could still operate. By doing quick math, the bar and shield realized they could lock them down for 3 months, and then the startup would only be left with a couple months of runway, which for a company basically means you're done. Barely enough cash to wind down operations and provide severance to the team. At that point, ALTA would have no other option but take the deal. Think about it. Sure, their collaboration was going well, but Harley could essentially get, for less, the parts they valued without having to take the parts they considered distractions. Business-wise, it was a brilliant move. And then they had another reason.
Look, essentially, HD were subsidizing 50% of the Gen 2 development costs. What if someone else, other than Harley, were to acquire ALTA? There was no guarantee that a new owner would still want to keep the collaboration alive. That's essentially how the electric manufacturer turned from an ally into the enemy, by doing nothing.
The offices in Brisbane felt different now. Less like a startup, more like a sinking ship. They had 5 days left on the clock, and a lot of people involved in the company wanted to give up. Yet 3 founders didn't. They tried reaching out to other potential buyers, seeking lifelines left and right.
I was able to get BRP on the phone. So Can-Am, Ski-Doo, Sea-Doo, Bombardier Racing product or recreational products. Say, look, guys, I think we pretty much laid it out. Like, we're in a rough spot. These guys are going to shut down the company and we're going to walk away with nothing. All you have to do is give us an acquisition offer that keeps our company alive, that keeps us going.
But time was running out. As Friday came around, the Harley deadline was a few hours away.
Hi Marc, it's Jose here. Look, we took a good look at your offer and I think this is good for everyone. So we decided BRP is going to acquire ALTA.
After a contentious board call, the ALTA team decided they were going to take the risk. And so, with 30 minutes left on the clock, ALTA makes the final call back to Harley.
at the 11th hour, I think we're within a half hour or 30 minutes of the expiration of their offer, and we tell them we're not going to take it. We get a whole bunch of expletives on the other end of the line. The head of M&A there lost his shit, which was understandable.
How could they not see this coming? This took them by surprise. It was a real shock. For them, ALTA shouldn't have had the option of saying no. They were sure the deal was done. And at that point, the shock turned into anger.
And so at that point, it was sort of a no expense spared, unleash the wolves on the situation.
From that moment in time, Harley was going to spare no legal expense in taking down ALTA. They were going to do everything in their power to strangle the little electric manufacturer. For Marc and his team, this call was a turning point, a point of hope. Unfortunately, it was also going to be the point of no return.
Remember, while the ship sailed through the storm, ALTA and Harley still had an active technical partnership. But you can't keep living with an abusive spouse, right? Harley, effective immediately, stopped working on the second-gen project. And that especially happened once they got wind of the competing BRP offer. The thing is, they couldn't really tell anyone about this. If Harley was to come out officially, that would have given ALTA the right to respond and let everybody know about the actual situation. That wouldn't exactly look good on the bar and shield. But what they could do is leak this information. That's how, on August 29th, Asphalt and Rubber published a rumor about the two companies parting ways. Now remember, ALTA was under a confidentiality agreement. They could counter-leak information, but
could never go on the record to clarify the situation. And then Harley had the change of mind. No, in fact, they decided not to end the partnership contract. In their mind, this could give them an argument to invoke a conflict of interest with BRP, so suddenly it became in their interest to keep the contract alive.
But when ALTA tried to end it from their end, Harley lawyers argued that a few terms from that agreement basically denied them from doing so. You have to understand something, all of this was happening behind the scenes. Other than the two parties involved, nobody had any idea. What made it worse was that after that rumor, it was still radio silence from ALTA. They simply could not say anything. From the outside, customers were still optimistic. They realized this collaboration most likely ended, but so what? Losing HD wasn't that big of a deal, right? ALTA was still shipping and updating bikes. Ultimately, they could just find other investors. Nobody thought the little manufacturer was in as much trouble. From a customer perspective, it was business as usual. With that being said, as mid-September came around, ALTA had still not come out with an official statement. Back in California, the company entered another 2-month due diligence period with this new buyer.
Wait, didn't I say ALTA was going to be out of cash? How could they afford to stay afloat for these 2 months? Well, they couldn't.
In fact, BRP and the existing investors agreed to loan the company about $5 million, split evenly between them, enough to keep them alive through the diligence period. All of this was happening while the startup kept shipping motorcycles. From the outside, this was peak ALTA, their best bikes, best reviews, all of it came during this time period. But on the inside, the company was imploding. They were days away from finalizing this deal and they got the green light from BRP.
We check all the boxes, we have handshake agreements with all of the decision makers, the deal is going to happen, and unfortunately at the 11th hour,
Hey Marc, sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I'm afraid we cannot keep going with this. BRP will not acquire ALTA.
At the 11th hour, BRP calls off the deal. Realistically speaking, only their insiders will know for sure why this happened. I mean, sure, in 2018, electric mobility companies still had solid question marks floating around them. So maybe that's why. Maybe the prospect of starting a fight with Harley was a good enough deterrent. Their harassment letters might have been enough to sway their decisions. Ultimately, we might never know for sure why BRP backed out after the handshake deal.
But we do know something, that according to Marc, Harley tried everything to get in the way. You see, while the due diligence was happening, Harley's legal team was sent after everyone involved.
So they sent the full weight of their legal team after us, after BRP.
Now, that makes sense. What doesn't is, what could Harley claim here? They couldn't claim to own the IP because, well, they didn't. No, they did something else.
Saying, hey, these guys still have this live agreement with us. They're under confidentiality, so you can't actually do the due diligence and share information.
Essentially, they weren't saying they owned ALTA's property, but they claimed that ALTA couldn't share it with anybody else. That was their main mechanism of harassment. With this, they threatened ALTA and BRP, trying to deny them from doing the due diligence because of this confidentiality. I can already hear you asking, how could such claim ever stand in a court of law?
Any reasonable lawyer in the venture space looked at that and said, this is completely frivolous, but nonetheless, we still have to respond to it. We have to defend ourselves. We have to send our own letters back. All that is enormously expensive for us at a time when we really don't have any money. We're running on fumes.
Most employees had to sign NDAs, agreements covering both intellectual property and actions from inside the company. No matter how much anyone tried to save ALTA from the inside, they had a gag order on them.
Look, in my opinion, ultimately, any company interested in taking over ALTA would have hit a wall. Sure, buying a small, struggling company is one thing.
Buying your way into a lawsuit with Harley Davidson, even if it's frivolous or slap?
That's different. Win or lose, it's a huge gamble and a huge cost.
At a time when electric manufacturers were worth pennies on the dollar compared to valuations just a year later. Monday morning, for dealers all around the country, it was business as usual. So you'd imagine their surprise when just 2 days later they got the news. ALTA was shutting down all operations. From the outside, nobody saw this coming. Asphalt and Robber reported on the news and a thank you post goes up on ALTA's social networks. The employees got the short end of the stick, only receiving minimum amounts of severance. The money had fully drained out. And ALTA managed to dig another dead hole worth roughly $5 million during the BRP talks. Behind the scenes, the founders were still trying. They tried operating at zero cost in order to hopefully find investors. They went back to other potential buyers, but at this point, it was way too late. Trying to save ALTA was like bringing Flex Seal to patch the Titanic's hull.
A thank you was all their customers got in that moment. On forums, riders got worried about future support and lack of warranties. Some people started throwing out false information, like them being acquired and saved by KTM.
In fact, Marc denies any such rumors, having never been in direct contact with KTM. Also, the ALTA team was still bound by their legal limbo, under threats of legal harassment by Harley. They had so much to say in that moment, but coming out would have been costly. Literally. You could argue this was the time when ALTA's poison pill took effect, when they finally went bankrupt. But what if I told you that, in fact, they never did? Technically and legally speaking, they never did. You see, you would expect their story to end here, but in reality, this was just the start.
A tale of vultures, secrecy, and a tight-knit community gathering around and putting everything they owned into trying to save the brand. A story filled to the brim with corporate legal limbos. If you thought the Harley debacle was put to rest, you are very wrong.